Are you looking for a fantasy football show that doesn't suck? You found it. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's having a great week. I had somebody in the comment section last week tell me that I should open up the show like that. They probably never thought that I would ever read their comment, much less say it, but I did. I saw it, thought it would be funny. I'm not a cocky type of guy, but that was just to get a quick laugh. Hopefully that grabbed some people's attention. Maybe you're here for the first time. Consider hitting that subscribe button. You're going to have a lot of fun with some fantasy football. And it's already week 11. The season is more than halfway over. The fantasy playoffs are right around the corner. And in this episode, we're talking about wide receivers here for week 11. Kind of similar to our running back video. I'm still going to go through all the matchups and the majority of all the receivers in these matchups. But I have also seen some comments, a few people kind of confused, where if I've said to start all the people on your roster, who do you go with? And I kind of understand that also. So going forward, I'm going to continue to give you my perspective, my analysis on these players, trying to help you get that decision. I don't want you to get hung up on my start or sit designation. There's been guys in the past who are saying, oh, well, you've told me to start this person over this person. Well, when you put the names together, you have to go with what makes sense. So I don't want you guys to get confused by those designations. I may throw them in, periodically, but it's not solely based off of that start or sit word. More off of the analysis and helping you guys get that perspective on making the right choice for your team, because that's what I'm here for. I'm not here to make your decisions for you, just trying to make them easier. So without further ado, let's get into week 11 of the fantasy football season and talk about some wide receivers. All right, Thursday Night Football, I have the Green Bay Packers at the Seattle Seahawks. Starting off with the Packers, Devontae Adams. Obvious, if you have him, you're going to play him. Had another great week last week against the Dolphins. Only 57 yards receiving, but did have 2 touchdowns once again. Like I said, if you got him, he's locked into your lineup every single week. MVS, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, another wide receiver we've talked about a lot. Somewhat of a down week, only 6 catches for 44 yards. That's still double-digit points in fantasy and in PPR fantasy leagues. And that's his 5th straight week with double digits. He's the number 2 option in an Aaron Rodgers-led offense who's going to see more and more targets each week. It's a decent matchup. The 19th ranked opposing defense of the Seattle Seahawks against opposing wide receivers, giving up on average 36 points per game. They've given up 4 receiving touchdowns to those opposing wide receivers over the last 3 games. Both these guys in an Aaron Rodgers-led offense are going to be decent plays, good plays, great plays for you every single week. All right, for the Seattle Seahawks, you got a trio of receivers that kind of just make you go, eh. I mean, you got Doug Baldwin, highly, highly irritating. Still hasn't started to produce. David Moore, who was hot for a few weeks but hasn't done much the last 2 weeks. And really the most consistent option is Tyler Lockett. He's had a touchdown every single week with the exception of 2 games this season. Not huge receiving numbers. Last week against the Rams, another 5 catches for 67 yards and a touchdown. They have a great matchup this week. The Packers are the 23rd ranked defense against opposing wide receivers, giving up 38 points per game. Nothing last week, but they played the Dolphins, so that's not a real big deal. They're definitely somebody you can throw on through the air. Tyler Lockett, in my opinion, is the only safe play in this wide receiver group right now. As much as I like Doug Baldwin, as much as I like the upside of Doug Baldwin, as much as I still think there's a chance that Doug Baldwin has decent games here, to end the season, as of right now, I just can't trust him in the lineup. We have to see more from him before we can do anything with him. Stash him on the bench. The only guy, like I said, I'm going to trust for week 11 is going to be Tyler Lockett. Bengals and Ravens are next. For the Bengals, we got Tyler Boyd and John Ross. Now, Tyler Boyd was kind of a letdown last week with the first game without A.J. Green. We expected a little bit more going up against a New Orleans Saints team in a game that the Bengals were trailing huge. So the game script played perfectly into the hands to give Tyler Boyd a great opportunity. He gets 3 catches for 65 yards, no touchdowns. One of his worst games in the past few weeks. And it's kind of disheartening. Now he gets a difficult matchup on the road against the Baltimore Ravens, who are 6th against opposing wide receivers, giving up on average 31 points a game, only giving up 2 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers in the last 4 weeks. This is a solid defense like we've talked about before in Baltimore. It kind of worries me that if he couldn't produce against the Saints, he may struggle again against the Ravens. We said it when this first happened with A.J. Green. With Tyler Boyd assuming that number 1 role, he also assumes the best defensive corner on the opposite side of the football. That could be a little bit, worrisome going forward. Tyler Boyd was a great number 2. He may not be ready to be a number 1 yet. He still has huge upside, but I'm going to hold off and keep him for the games that he actually has a decent matchup. I'm not feeling it this week. Tyler Boyd is actually going to be one of my sits for the week. John Ross, he's got that home run potential, right? He only had 2 catches last week, but it was 39 yards and a touchdown. More of a standard league play, more of a home run touchdown dependent play, not going to see huge volume. If maybe a DFS play at best for John Ross, but that's about it. He's just not going to see the amount of targets he needs to give you that solid, safe day. He's big play dependent, and right now, at this point of the fantasy football season, I don't want to just wing it. I'm looking for the best players in the best matchups, and I'm not feeling it this week for the wide receivers in Cincinnati. For the Ravens, this may somewhat depend on the availability of Joe Flacco, or if Lamar Jackson takes over under center. It could really limit the upside slightly of some of these wide receivers. Now, yes, I'm keeping the hashtag. It's week 11, and I'm not going to break it again. Never Crabtree still exists. But what about John Brown and Willie Snead? John Brown started off the season hot. He had great games the first 4 weeks of the season. Since that, he's only had 1 game in fantasy football with double-digit points. Willie Snead has been the most consistent receiver in this offense. He's had double-digit fantasy points every single week, with the exception of 2 weeks. The game before their bye week, week 9, against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 7 catches for 58. Nothing flashy for slick Willie Snead. He's just somebody who's been a consistent flex play for a few weeks, and it's a great matchup. The Cincinnati Bengals just got annihilated by the New Orleans Saints, who are really annihilating everybody to this point. But the Bengals secondary has been, absolutely great for opposing wide receivers. In the past 4 games, they've given up 6 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, on average almost 41 points a game in PPR leagues. Definitely a great start. But do I trust any of these guys this week? Not really. I mean, it really depends on Joe Flacco's availability, which is crazy because it's Joe Flacco. But he, going to Lamar Jackson and what could be his first ever NFL start, it's really going to depend on who he looks for, who he locks onto. It may be one of the rookie tight ends. We really don't know what's going to happen if Lamar Jackson is under center. I expect a lot more running the ball if that happens. And until we see, or until we get word if Flacco's practicing fully, if he's going to be a full go, whatever it is, I'm tempering expectations on all these wide receivers. And as of right now, I would really prefer not to have to start any of them until at least we see what happens with the quarterback situation and maybe who the favorite target of Lamar Jackson would be if he gets into the ball games going forward. All right, Cowboys and Falcons are next. For the Cowboys, we'll talk about Amari Cooper. Still can't get on this bandwagon. I'm not a huge Amari Cooper believer. I've seen the social media clips with him burning his defender, running great routes, getting open, gaining separation. I've seen those clips. Here's my issue. You don't get points in fantasy football for yards of separation or just running a good route. You get points for receptions, yardage, and touchdowns. Last week against the Philadelphia Eagles, 6 receptions, 75 yards, no touchdowns. Decent day. Not great, not horrible. That's right where Amari Cooper belongs, in my opinion. The not great, but not horrible category. That's where Amari Cooper will live. It's a great matchup. Usually you want to start your wide receivers against the Atlanta Falcons. They've given up receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers every single week since week 1. This is definitely a team that you would like to throw or use your opposing wide receivers. They're playing against the Falcons. It's a great matchup. That gives them great potential. And Amari Cooper is the clear-cut number 1 in that offense. The problem is, don't overhype him. He's not a wide receiver 1. He may have decent weeks. On the weeks he scores touchdowns. But if he doesn't get you that touchdown, more than likely you're going to be disappointed with what you get from Amari Cooper. He's a decent start for the week, and I can't believe I'm saying that. But there are worse options than Amari Cooper this week. I'm not against starting him. I'm not looking forward to starting him. If you have better options, I wouldn't blame you for starting them over him. However, matchup-wise, number-wise, Amari Cooper looks like a decent start with limited upside this week. Like I said, it's really touchdown dependent on whether you're happy or pissed at the end of the game. For the Falcons, you have the trio of Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, and Mohamed Sanu. Now, Julio Jones, he's locked into your lineup more than likely. He's a starting wide receiver every single week. He's now had touchdowns 2 straight weeks, so the world can rejoice to that. I said it 2 weeks ago when I expected him to get his first touchdown that don't be surprised if he starts scoring touchdowns in bunches now. It could possibly happen, and I like the possibility for that again this week. Calvin Ridley was very disappointing last week against the Browns. 3 catches for 37. Same goes for Mohamed Sanu. 6 for 47. This is a very difficult matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. Currently the number 2 ranked defense against opposing wide receivers. Haven't allowed a receiving touchdown to an opposing wide receiver since week 6, and that was the Jacksonville Jaguars. You can throw on him. You just can't score touchdowns against him. To me, Julio Jones is a slam dunk play. The other 2, Ridley and Sanu, are really only bye-week fill-ins for me this week with this matchup. They do have huge upside. They have touchdown upside, but I wouldn't call them a safe play here for week 11. More of, like I said, a bye-week fill-in, an injury replacement. Calvin Ridley would be a slight hair above Mohamed Sanu. Ridley always has that big play potential that you can't forget about, and that's why I slightly put him ahead of Sanu. Bucks and Giants are next for the Bucks. This could get really difficult for the next few weeks. Now, Mike Evans is going to be the guy that you start every week if you have him. You may be a little bit worried about Mike Evans because the last 2 weeks he has a combined 4 catches for 67 yards combined between those 2 games. And now we're starting to see the likes of Deshaun Jackson, Chris Godwin, Adam Humphries. They're all involved. O.J. Howard is involved. You had Jacquezie Sheezy in the backfield catching a lot of balls last week. There's a lot of options in this offense, and it's going to be really hard to pinpoint who's going to have the good week each week. You can say, you're going to target the guys in the slot. Well, they move these guys around a lot. Outside of Evans, they all get time in the slot. It's going to be really hard to pinpoint it. They do have a difficult matchup this week. The New York Giants are the 5th-ranked defense against opposing wide receivers. Haven't allowed a touchdown to an opposing wide receiver since week 7. It's definitely a solid defense there. They are giving up, on average, 29 points to opposing wide receivers. But which one do you start? It's a total crapshoot. There's not one guy that you really like more than the other. A couple weeks ago, everybody was drooling over Adam Humphries and his 8 catches for 82 yards and 2 touchdowns. What happened the following week? It was Chris Godwin's week, 7 catches for 103 yards. Then you had Deshaun Jackson. He's been fairly consistent. 5 catches for 67 last week. Everybody is involved in this offense is my point. If you have one, they're no more than a flex play to me just because we can't trust their upside and their inconsistencies because on any given week, any one of them can go off. We just can't pinpoint which one it's going to be. Outside of Mike Evans, like I said, everybody else is a flex start, bye-week fill-in at best. For the Giants, you have Odell Beckham and Sterling Shepard. Now, if you have Odell, he's an obvious must-start. Didn't absolutely light up the scoreboard. Only had 4 catches for 73 yards last week, but 2 of those catches were for touchdowns, which really gave him a solid performance. If you have him, he's locked into your lineup. Sterling Shepard struggled somewhat too. Only 2 catches for 9 yards, but did get the touchdown to slightly salvage a fantasy day. But now they get a great matchup. The 31st ranked defense against opposing wide receivers in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have allowed receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers every single week this season. They are definitely a team that you like to start your wide receivers against. Both of these guys are great plays for me here in Week 11. Steelers and Jags are next, so you have Antonio Brown and Juju. Now, I'm not going to start Antonio Brown. I'm just kidding. Of course you're starting Antonio Brown. I don't care who he plays against. Antonio Brown is in your... I don't care if it's the Jaguars. I don't care if it's I don't care who it is. You start Antonio Brown. Juju is somebody who has kind of reached that must-start level also, right? A lot of the defensive attention goes towards Antonio Brown. It'll now start going towards James Conner going forward. Juju kind of receives a lot of single coverage, and he's done great. The touchdowns haven't really been there. Only 3 receiving touchdowns on the season, but he's somebody who's so involved in the game that you can't really sit him. You can't really afford to sit him because of his upside. Only had 3 catches last week, but he turned it into 90 yards and a touchdown. One was a 75-yard touchdown play that basically gave you a solid fantasy day on that one play. He's been in double digits every single week with the exception of week 8, despite the tough matchup going up against the number 1 ranked defense against opposing wide receivers in the Jacksonville Jaguars. It doesn't matter. Both these guys should be in a lineup somewhere. All right, for the Jags, you got D.D. Westbrook and Dante Moncrief. This is not one of these, elite passing offenses. Neither one of these guys are absolute must starts. D.D. has been a somewhat safer play-ish over his past 2 games. He's averaged 10 fantasy points a game in PPR leagues. This past week against the Colts, 5 catches for 30 yards. Nothing great, nothing good to write home about. Dante Moncrief had a little bit better game. Only 3 catches, but made it count, 98 yards and a touchdown. He's had double digits 2 out of his last 3 games. It's just not a great passing offense in Jacksonville, especially now that Leonard Fournette is back. That's somebody who's going to eat up, 25 to 30 touches a week just by himself. That limits the upsides of these wide receivers. They're only bye week fill-ins, injury replacement, flex plays at best for me going forward. Rest of season, they do have a decent matchup. The Pittsburgh Steelers are the 22nd ranked defense against opposing wide receivers, giving up on average 37 points a game. However, they haven't allowed a receiving touchdown to a wide receiver in the last 2 weeks. They've been playing improved football. They've looked great the past couple of weeks. Personally, I'm going to avoid all Jacksonville wide receivers, probably for the foreseeable future, especially as long as Leonard Fournette is healthy. Just limits the upsides of these guys going forward because they're running the ball so much, running the clock, and running less plays as a team on offense. Texans and Redskins are next, and for the Texans, you got DeAndre Hopkins. Not going to sell you on him. Automatic, must start. He's currently the number 5 wide receiver in all of fantasy football. But then I'm going to talk about Demaryius Thomas, somebody who I really didn't like 2 weeks ago. His first game as a Houston Texan didn't come out and blow it away. He had 3 catches for 61 yards, most of which came in the first quarter. Saw limited snaps. Now going forward, I really like Demaryius Thomas in this offense. The opposing defense is going to pay attention to DeAndre Hopkins. Number 1, Demaryius Thomas is a former number 1 wide receiver, now getting to kind of slide into that number 2 role, where the defense really isn't focusing on him as much as they have in years past. I really like Demaryius Thomas this week. He's one of my starts of the week, going up against the 26th ranked defense in the Washington Redskins. Yes, they've only allowed 2 receiving touchdowns in the past 3 weeks to opposing wide receivers. However, the last 4 games that the Washington Redskins have played, they've allowed a total of over 200 yards a game to these opposing wide receivers. I really like Demaryius Thomas. I would have both Hopkins, Thomas in my lineups if I had them. Not both at the same time, people. I'm talking if you own one of them, definitely would have them in my lineup. I like the matchup. I like the possibility of them coming off the bye week and getting Demaryius Thomas more involved. He's, like I said, he's one of my starts of the week. And DeAndre Hopkins is a must-start no matter what. Still have a jumbled mess of wide receivers for the Washington Redskins. We got Josh Doxson and Maurice Harris. A lot of people thought Maurice Harris was going to, double down and have another huge game this past week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Only 5 receptions for 52 yards. Josh Doxson, I guess a little better because he had 4 for 46, but also had a touchdown. Now his second straight week with a touchdown. But it's a tough matchup. They get the number 7th ranked defense of the Houston Texans coming off a bye week. Haven't allowed a touchdown in opposing wide receiver since week 6. It's a solid defense. Personally, I want nothing to do with any of the wide receivers in Washington, not only this week, but I don't know if I want anything to do with them going forward. Titans and Colts are next, and for the Titans, I actually kind of like Corey Davis this week. Not just because of last week where he had 7 catches for 125 yards and a touchdown. He now has 13 receptions over the last 2 games. Yes, it's somewhat of a difficult matchup. The Colts have allowed on average 32 points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, is that going to all go to Corey Davis? No. But he is going to get the bulk of the targets in that offense in Tennessee. He's really their top, maybe one of their only options in the passing game, outside of maybe Dion Lewis. He's going to see 10-plus targets a week. Not very many wide receivers in football see that amount of volume on a week-to-week basis. He has the upside. He has the touchdown upside. They look for him in the red zone. It is a tough matchup, but they're going to have to throw the ball in Tennessee to keep pace with Andrew Luck and the Colts, whose offense is finally starting to turn the corner and look a little bit better. I like Corey Davis this week for Week 11, and I'm not afraid to say it. On the Colts side of the football, we have T.Y. Hilton. And I've told you guys in multiple videos how much I like the defense of the Tennessee Titans. So you would probably think that I didn't really like T.Y. Hilton this week. I didn't like him last week against Jacksonville. Only had 3 catches for 77 yards, no touchdowns. I actually like T.Y. Hilton this week a little bit more. than a lot of people. It's easier to throw on the Titans than it is to run on them. They're giving up on average 38 points per game. They've given up a total of 5 touchdowns in their last 4 games to opposing wide receivers. Yes, they shut down Tom Brady and the New England Patriots last week, but they did give up over 200 yards receiving to those wide receivers. T.Y. Hilton is due for a breakout. Him and Andrew Luck are too good of a combination to not eventually get this thing figured out. They're going to start featuring him a little bit more and more as the season goes on. T.Y. Hilton's going to get more involved, a lot more than his 3 for 77. I expect more targets going his way, more receptions because of those targets, and that only boosts the upside of the possible touchdown. I like T.Y. Hilton a lot here in Week 11. Panthers and Lions are next. For the Panthers, you have Never Funchess, which will remain, and you have DJ Moore. DJ Moore is somebody we were really high on back in Week 8. We saw him against the Baltimore Ravens get 5 catches for 90 yards, 18 fantasy points. He led the team in targets. His snap count was the highest it's been all season. He had really started to turn the corner and get really involved in this offense. They were giving him handoffs out of the backfield on end arounds. He was really getting involved. And then it kind of just faded the past 2 weeks. And there's no sense to be made of it. They've had 2 great matchups against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Typically games that wide receivers have good games against, especially last week in a game where they were trailing from start to finish almost against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He ended up with 4 catches for 20 yards. There's something going on in Carolina that really won't produce a top wide receiver on a consistent basis. Partially because Greg Olsen is getting a little bit more involved. Christian McCaffrey is absolutely killing it. He's scoring all the touchdowns. DJ Moore is actually going to be one of my sits for the week because he's just turned into somebody who's way too inconsistent. Maybe what Devin Funchess has is contagious? I guess, maybe. For the Lions, you got Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay. We really need to watch the practice reports and the injury reports this week for Marvin Jones. It looks like he escaped a major injury. Only a bone bruise is what it's being called now, but how much he's limited or if he plays this week is still up in the air. Something to definitely pay attention to. Kenny Golladay is somebody who, if Marvin Jones is out, could turn into this solid number 1 wide receiver, where just a few weeks ago he was their number 3. We all love the upside of Kenny Golladay, and he had a great week last week against the Chicago Bears, 6 catches, 78 yards, and a touchdown, and he's somebody with crazy, crazy upside if Marvin Jones sits. However, I like both of them this week. The injury to Marvin Jones is a little bit, concerning. If he's limited throughout the week, I wouldn't start him. I don't know if I want to take a chance of him going out there in the first quarter, feeling the pain and not really being able to finish. Kenny Golladay is somebody who I would definitely like to have in my lineups this week, going against the 20th ranked defense of the Carolina Panthers against opposing wide receivers. They've given up multiple touchdowns to opposing wide receivers the last 2 straight weeks. They've allowed over 40 fantasy points to opposing wide receivers the last 2 straight weeks. Definitely a team that you can throw on here as of late. And Kenny Golladay is somebody who could have some huge upside. Like I said, the injury worries me with Marvin Jones until we hear more about it. If it comes out that he's completely fine and practicing fully, I'd like to have him in my lineup also. But if he's limited at all, I wouldn't risk it personally. Broncos and Chargers are next, and we'll be talking about Emmanuel Sanders and Courtland Sutton for the Denver Broncos. Now, Emmanuel Sanders, don't forget, just because he was on the bye last week, this guy is still a wide receiver 1 right now, currently wide receiver 11 in PPR leagues. He hasn't had a touchdown the past 2 weeks. However, he does have 3 on the season. He's led the team in 100-yard games so far this year. They're going to be on the road against the Chargers, who like to score a lot of points, especially at home. Really hard to stop Keenan Allen, Melvin Gordon, and Phillip Rivers on a weekly basis. Denver is going to have to continue to throw a lot in this game. And now that Demaryius Thomas is out of the picture, Emmanuel Sanders continues with his target share, but a lot more starts going towards Courtland Sutton. Now, he was somewhat of a disappointment their game before the bye. 3 catches for 57 yards. Nothing to write home about. It wasn't absolutely horrible, but it wasn't a great game either. I think Courtland Sutton is going to be one of these touchdown-dependent guys going forward. If he doesn't score you a touchdown, you're really going to be disappointed with his performance. He's somewhat big play dependent. I like the upside of Courtland Sutton. He would be a bye-week fill-in possibly for me, not a must-start every single week. Maybe an injury replacement, a last-minute injury replacement. Maybe like for a Marvin Jones, if he's limited all week, then I would put somebody like Courtland Sutton in over him possibly. But outside of that scenario, I'm really just sticking with Emmanuel Sanders. It is somewhat of a tougher matchup this week. The Chargers are the 12th ranked defense against opposing wide receivers. Last week against Oakland, never mind, it's Oakland. Obviously, they're not going to do a whole lot. The week before that against the Seahawks, they gave up 125 yards and a touchdown to opposing wide receivers. They have only allowed one in their last 4 games, which isn't bad. But this, like I said, is going to be an offense in Denver that's going to have to throw the ball a lot, like the upside of Emmanuel Sanders. Cortland Sutton, though, like I said, more of a bye-week fill-in, injury replacement at best. All right, for the Chargers, you have Keenan Allen and Tyrell Williams is who we'll be talking about today. Keenan Allen is somebody who I said a couple weeks ago, don't give up on Keenan Allen just yet. Better days are to come. After their bye week, he's averaging 19 fantasy points a game, which is great. He's up to the number 17 wide receiver in PPR leagues. It is a difficult matchup-ish. Not so much as difficult as it used to be when you played the Denver Broncos. They are giving up on average 34 points a game. They've given up 4 receiving touchdowns in their last 3 games to opposing wide receivers. They're not what they used to be, right, in Denver. They're not that lockdown, shutdown defense anymore. To me, Keenan Allen is somebody that's in your lineup every single week. Tyrell Williams is a little bit more home run dependent. Only had 4 catches for 46 yards last week. He does have double digits 3 out of the last 4 games. However, in all those games, he did score a touchdown. Another one of those guys where if he doesn't get you that touchdown on a weekly basis, you could be disappointed because the volume isn't really there. I'm safe starting Keenan Allen. Tyrell Williams is a little bit of a stretch for me. I would prefer to sit him this week if at all possible. If you had no other better options, he is somebody with touchdown upside, big play ability. But like I said, it's just more of a risk with Tyrell Williams than anything else. Raiders and Cardinals are next, and for the Raiders, you are going to... Nope, you're not starting anybody in Oakland. For the Cardinals, you have Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk. I was a little bit disappointed in Larry Fitzgerald last week. I expected a little bit more than his 6 for 50. Christian Kirk also disappointed. Only 2 catches for 8 yards against a Kansas City Chiefs team in which the Cardinals relied a lot on the passing game. These guys just weren't overly involved. RSJ had one of his better games of the season. David Johnson had his best game of the season. But going forward, this week especially, a home game against the lowly Oakland Raiders who are just in full tank mode at this point, I like both Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk. I think they both have upside. They both have touchdown upside. Christian Kirk more of the big play guy. Larry Fitzgerald more of the possession receiver, the move the chain, more PPR option. Christian Kirk more of a standard league play. But both of these guys have upside. Every time you play against the Oakland Raiders, you have upside. Why? Because defense is optional at times in Oakland. They've given up on average 35 points to opposing wide receivers, 3 touchdowns over the past 2 weeks, including last week to the Chargers, 10 receptions, 103 yards, and a touchdown. This is definitely a team that you want to start your players against just because you never know which Raiders team is going to show up. More than likely, the team that really doesn't care. I would have no issue starting either Larry Fitzgerald or Christian Kirk wherever you may need them this week in Week 11. Eagles and Saints are next, and to quote the late, great Forrest Gump, I like the wide receivers a lot. I like it a lot this week because these guys could put up some huge points for the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, Alshon Jeffrey and Golden Tate, and we'll mention Nelson Aguilar, are all solid plays for me this week. Anytime you play against the New Orleans Saints, you can count on a few things. 1, the Saints are going to score. 2, the Saints are going to score quickly, which could give you more offensive plays as their opponent. Right now, they are the 32nd ranked defense against opposing wide receivers, giving up on average 48 points per game. They've allowed touchdown receptions by opposing wide receivers every single week, with the exception of Week 5. This is definitely a team that you like to start your wide receivers against because you know that they're going to have to throw the ball a lot to keep pace with the New Orleans Saints. Alshon Jeffrey, in my opinion, is going to be the top target of Carson Wentz. He only had 4 for 48 last week against a tough Dallas team. Golden Tate, who was a sit for me last week, only 2 for 19. Wasn't overly involved, only played 18 snaps last week. I like Golden Tate a lot this week. Don't be surprised if Golden Tate has a coming out party as a Philadelphia Eagle this week. Would not surprise me one bit. Nelson Aguilar, maybe more of just like a solid PPR flex play, maybe at best. 5 catches for 83 yards last week. Wasn't, this guy that's going to have a huge ceiling. He hasn't really been all year. Decent play. If I had to pick one of this trio this week, I really like Golden Tate, and I won't be surprised if he has the best week out of any of these three guys. For the Saints, you have Michael Thomas, and we'll continue to talk about Tre'Quan Smith. Why? I don't know. The guy hasn't done anything. We really shouldn't be talking about him, but I really don't think the newly signed Brandon Marshall is going to bring anything to the table after being a Saint for like 6 hours this week. I mean, I just don't expect a whole lot from anybody else in this offense outside of the name Michael Thomas as a wide receiver. Last week, another huge game, 8 receptions, 70 yards, 2 touchdowns. That now gives him 20 receptions, 281 yards, and 3 touchdowns the last 2 weeks. He's the number 1 fantasy wide receiver right now in PPR leagues. Great play. If you have him, he's a must-start. Tre'Quan Smith has upside. I don't feel comfortable starting him right now because of his lack of usage. It's pretty much just Ingram, Kamara, and Thomas at this point that are your consistent plays. Outside of that, everybody's a crapshoot. I wouldn't necessarily drop Tre'Quan Smith unless there's somebody of higher value on waivers, because his upside is huge in this offense if he gets the opportunity. But Michael Thomas is a surefire start for you. Going up against the 28th ranked defense this week of the Philadelphia Eagles, giving up on average 41 points a game. They didn't give up any passing touchdowns or receiving touchdowns last week to opposing wide receivers. They played the Cowboys. However, before that, they'd given up one every single week, with the exception of week 1 and week 6. So it's definitely a team you can throw against there in Philadelphia. A lot easier to throw against them than it is to run against them. Love some Michael Thomas this week. Sunday Night Football, you got the Vikings and the Bears. And for the Vikings, Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. If they're healthy, you start them. Thielen's fine. Diggs is somewhat of a question mark. He did come out himself and say that he would play on Sunday. Sounds like he possibly will, more than likely. If he does, if he's practicing fully by the end of the week, there's no reason why you would want to sit either one of these guys in a matchup against the Chicago Bears, who are giving up on average 36 points a game. Last week against the Detroit Lions, you saw Kenny Galladay have a decent game. They gave up 151 yards and a touchdown to opposing wide receivers. They've given up over 100 yards receiving to opposing wide receivers every single week, with the exception of week 9. But week 9 was against Buffalo. And I mean the old Buffalo, the one that doesn't score 40-point Buffalo. That's the only team that has not had over 100 yards receiving from their wide receivers. It's definitely a team you can throw on. And I really like Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs this week, but why wouldn't you? All right, for the Bears, we have Allen Robinson, Anthony Miller, and Taylor Gabriel. Taylor Gabriel, who's been a huge disappointment the past couple weeks. This past week against Detroit, didn't even show up on the stat sheet. Had a whole lot of nothing. Anthony Miller had a decent week. 5 catches for 122 yards and a touchdown. I'll take that any day. Allen Robinson had his best game of the season. 6 catches for 133 yards and 2 touchdowns. This was a team last week that was very explosive through the air. Now they get the Minnesota Vikings, who are one of the hottest teams on defense before their bye week. They've had a whole week to prep for this game. They will be playing on the road in Chicago. Still up in the air, but it sounds like Xavier Rhodes may be good to go. If he does go, I really don't like Allen Robinson this week. Now, a lot of people are going to see his performance last week and be like, there he is. Allen Robinson's back. We got to start him every week. Not so much. I'm really kind of fading Allen Robinson this week. I don't expect what we saw last week to continue. It's not like a weekly occurrence. If I've learned one thing about the Chicago Bears offense, is that it's very hit and miss. You don't know who's going to beat you on any given week. Jordan Howard, Tariq Cohen, Trey Burton, Allen Robinson, Anthony Miller, Taylor Gabriel have all been fantasy relevant at some point or another throughout this season. It's really hard to pinpoint who it's going to be. If I had to pick one this week, it would be Anthony Miller in this offense. I think he draws the easier coverage and could see a higher touchdown upside this week. In my opinion, he's the best wide receiver this week, week 11 for the Chicago Bears, going up against one of the best pass defenses in football, the Minnesota Vikings, who haven't allowed a receiving touchdown to an opposing wide receiver since week 4, and that was that game with a lot of points scored against the Los Angeles Rams. Definitely a solid defense in Minnesota. Allen Robinson really worries me this week. Monday Night Football, you got the Chiefs and the Rams. All these guys are going to be, somebody that you really want to have in your lineup. For the Chiefs, Tyreek Hill, obviously somebody you're going to put in there. Sammy Watkins, we need to see if this foot injury is healed enough for him to play here in Week 11. There's already reports coming out saying that he should return this week. If he's not 100% full go by the end of the week, I'm not even considering starting Sammy Watkins if there's any limitations. On the Rams side of the football, this is something we need to talk about also. There's no more Cooper Kupp. right? What happened the last time Cooper Kupp was out? We saw a little bit more Josh Reynolds. So Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks, obvious must-starts on a weekly basis. They're both inside the top 10. Actually, they are at the top 10, 9 and 10 respectively for Woods and Cooks in PPR leagues. Josh Reynolds is somebody who gets a huge bump in value. You may have claimed him off your waiver wire. Maybe no more than a bye week fill-in or a flex play at best. He doesn't have that consistency that you want to see, that you would normally see from a Cooper Kupp. Robert Woods is somebody who gets a huge bump in value here, and if you got one of these guys, they're definite starts. This could be an absolute offensive explosion to get the Rams and the Chiefs on the same field together. It should be a lot of fun. All right, those are all the wide receiver matchups here for Week 11. Hopefully, I was able to help you make your decision a little bit easier. If not, throw it down in the comment section. Got almost 27,000 people in this community willing to try to help each other out. I get to as many as I possibly can, but obviously I can't get to all of them. I greatly appreciate your support. This channel is almost reaching to number 2. We are almost the second largest fantasy football channel on YouTube as far as an independent channel goes. Obviously, I'm not there with the big networks. We're not there with the big networks yet, but we're on our way, and I greatly appreciate that support. If you guys need anything, like I said, hit me up down in the comment section. I can always read them. Just can't always respond to every one of them. Really looking forward to the live show on Saturday. Right now, scheduled for 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the bell notification. You want to know as soon as we go live, because I'll be answering all your questions, interacting, letting it flow for about an hour Saturday afternoon. Looking forward to it. You guys have a good rest of your week, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks.